righteous rejoice, there is great glory. But when the wicked arise, men hide themselves. He who covers his sins will not prosper, but whoever confesses and forsakes them will have mercy. Happy is the man who is always reverent, but he who hardens his heart will fall into calamity, like a roaring lion and a charging bear.
Since the dawn of media, the idea of a flawed protagonist has always been a favored choice. Amongst all the stories of black and white, or good and evil, tales about characters who sit more in that gray area, or even just kind of exist in the dark yet have redeeming qualities, have become the standout. It's essentially the basis of the Gothic literature genre, and the journeys that we experience when we read about characters such as Dr. Frankenstein and his monster, Count Dracula, or even the embodiment of vanity himself, Dorian Gray. But even outside of the confines of books written specifically to carry a drab and melancholic tone, we do get characters like the kid from Blood Meridian, or even lovable pieces of shit like Odesu from Oldboy, and sometimes even morally good characters that are just riddled with pride and grief like Edward Elric. And the reason that these characters are so interesting, even though many of times they end up being characters about as rotten as the villains, is because of the simple fact that they're more human than a hero character. Because they relate more to your average person. Your average Joe is not some good, wholesome person, at least not entirely. But neither is he probably a bad one either. The reality is that your average person is complex. They're a cross between a lot of positive and negative characteristics. But what really defines a person on being good or bad is less about their aspects and the makeup of their internal character, and rather their external character, or the content of their choices. And that's what makes the average anti-hero or flawed protagonist or even just blank characters so engaging. And I think that there's no other piece of media that better encapsulates this and explores this concept better than the beloved masterpiece we know as Silent Hill 2. Silent Hill 2 is a game that needs no real introduction. It's a story that's had no stone left unturned, nothing left unanalyzed, and in all honesty, it's been spoken on so much that it's become a bit of a cliche. Yet, even after 2.5 decades, we still want to talk about it. We still want to dig our claws in and see just what else we can scrape out of this thing. And that right there should show as a testament of just how much of a masterpiece this game really is. And that's simply because Silent Hill 2 is a story that holds so much underneath its deceptively simple story. On the surface, it's just the tale of a widowed man entering a haunted town in search of his wife, only to encounter the paranormal and the horrors beyond his comprehension. But underneath lies a complex and abyssal tale of grief, denial, violence, and guilt. All the aspects that, when wrapped up with a little bow on it, makes up its protagonist, and better yet, the town itself. So, why don't we talk about it? Why don't we embark on our own journey into Silent Hill?
In my restless dreams, I see that town. Silent Hill. You promised you'd take me there again someday, but you never did. Well, I'm alone there now, in our special place, waiting for you. Waiting for you to come to see me.
The game begins as a lone man sulks in his misery and displacement.
Mary, could you really be in this town?
In my restless dreams, I see that town. Silent Hill.
He laments the death of his wife before revealing that he somehow received a letter from her. His confusion of just how all this is possible is evident, and even what the letter itself truly means begins to eat away at him. Everything about this rest stop just screams something ominous. From the thick fog outside obscuring our sight, the empty and void area with no signs of life around us, and the broken down entrance left shut, preventing any cars from entering. All signs point to turning back and letting it all go. But like a moth to a flame, he can't help but make his way into the town. And as he does so, the world only continues to warp. The woods ooze with foreboding noises, a warning of just what's to come. But once he makes it to the graveyard, we're given one final warning.
Excuse me,
I'm sorry. I
No,
was
it's
just...
okay. I didn't mean to scare you. I'm kind of lost.
Lost?
Yeah.
The interaction here is awkward. Both characters jilted and strange in their mannerisms and ways of speaking. Both of these people are here in search of someone, as if they're both drifting lost souls that have crossed paths. The woman tries to tell us to be careful if we want to go to the town and deter us, but our protagonist decides that it's best if he continues, regardless of the dangers. But it's after this encounter that we finally reach a point of no return. The trail begins to form into a decrepit alleyway, one that leads us closer to the town's heart. And once we get there, we're met with a place that leaves us in a complete state of dread. Alright, now, the thing about Silent Hill and the series overall is that the star of the show is never its protagonist or even one simple monster. It's always the setting. And that's because Silent Hill is less of a physical space or a makeup of characters or some sort of canon, and it's more so just a spiritual being, or rather, a cosmic entity. Game to game, the town shifts in its form and makeup. The settings are always familiar to a certain extent, yet feel distinctly different. And in many ways, it's because Silent Hill ends up being a bit of an extension of the protagonist. But we'll get into that a bit later. On the surface, it might seem a bit like I'm overhyping things when I say that this first area is a manifestation of complete dread, and well, if you've never played the game and you're just spoiling it with this video, then yeah, it looks like just a foggy, empty town with some low poly graphics. Nothing all that special. But if you actually sit down and play this thing, it feels so much different. The emptiness is much more profound when you're just walking around these big empty streets. No signs of life in any corner to be found. Every building looks decrepit and run down. Parts of the map are just these gaping chasms. And it only gets worse when you go inside of the buildings and see that it all really just looks like the rapture happened. The dread comes from just how alone you initially feel, but from the warnings given to you from the sound cues in the woods, as well as the fact that we're playing a horror game, we know that we're not alone, and even if we are, we won't be for too long. And at any point, we could come face to face with something. But what that is a mystery to us. And that's where a lot of this dread and discomfort comes from. It's being trapped in the unknown. But that's not to say that the game lets us sit like this for too long. Not too far into the town, we will see a figure walking deeper into the fog. And despite its obviously strange appearance, our protagonist decides to pursue, believing it to be his wife. Though more than likely, it's just the desperation at this point. And the deeper we get, the more wrong everything begins to seem. Until we eventually reach the end of the road, and we catch up to our prey. only to take a step inside to get a better look. And
Is it dead? What the hell is it? It's not human.
this is how our journey begins. We've crossed the threshold and entered into a set of events that we can't escape. We are now stuck in Silent Hill. The game doesn't really waste time in setting its stage. A man entering a town in search of the impossible, only to be met with things beyond his understanding. But in that, he is a man unafraid of this path. Our protagonist is none other than James Sunderland, a deeply troubled man who is in search of his wife. And for us, he is our window into the world of Silent Hill, the vessel whose eyes paint each picture that we see and manifest the journey we are about to embark on. The thing about James, though, is that he isn't your typical hero character, or even really your typical passive protagonist either. Rather, James is a strange mixture of an unreliable narrator and a blank canvas. Outside of his desire to find Mary, James is nothing more than an empty shell. He has little concern for his own safety and well-being, is mostly absent in his interactions with others, seeming like only a small bit of his mind is even focusing on the conversations that he's having. And despite the obvious horrors that surround him, he almost never seems to flinch. He might object in the moment, but in the end, he'll just grit and bear things and move forward as fast as he can. All his emotions are muted in gray. And, well, that's the thing about James. There is an idea of a James Sunderland, some kind of abstraction, but there is no real James. Only an entity. And though he can hide his cold gaze, and you can shake his hand and feel his flesh gripping yours, and maybe you can even sense that your lifestyles are probably comparable, he is simply not there. James is but a surrogate, a chasm of feeling. And while initially this could be chalked up to him being the hollowed remains of a widowed man, someone whose grief and sorrow has completely overtaken him, where James really becomes more interesting is in the moments where his aloof, hollow facade cracks.
We better get out of here soon.
Yeah, you're right. What about you?
I'll leave as soon as I'm done here.
Moments where we get a glimpse at something a lot more real.
You're coming with me?
You were gonna just leave me?
No, but...
With all these monsters around?
No, I just...
More animated.
It's kind of hard to explain, but
Is it dangerous?
maybe. And it's not just the fog either.
Okay,
It's...
I got it. I'll be careful.
I'm not lying.
No, I believe you. It's just... I guess I really don't care. if it's dangerous or not.
and that carries some genuine feeling. But all these are just glimpses and nothing more. An interesting aspect of James is that until the end of the game, or really the last quarter of it, the only way we really get to know him is through the world itself and the way that it emotes to us. Alright, let's take a bit of a step back. Now, if there's one thing you really could say about Silent Hill 2 in terms of its peers in the survival horror genre, it's that it's a massive case of less is more. The other games in the series play very heavily into their stylization and aesthetics, creating something unique and evocative between each entry. With the first game, it's a little bit more muted due to the limited graphics of the original PlayStation. But once you get into the other world, the game exudes this very rusty, orange and pale green sort of aesthetic to it, radiating copper tones and allowing its more stylized and distinctive visuals to shine against its more primitive and flat aesthetic, thanks to the low poly look of the PlayStation 1. And when you add in the motif of these more bug-like creatures that can be seen in the game, and I guess overall just more traditional looking monsters, it helps to really define the way the original Silent Hill visually identified itself. The entire thing screams that it's a suburban horror experience in the vein of Stephen King. And that's the thing here. Each game's aesthetic and overall look tends to be reflective of the characters being portrayed. And it's right here for everyone to see. Silent Hill 1 is a case of a normal everyday father, like Harry Mason, taking on a murderous demonic cult trying to bring upon their god to the world, such as the Order. And when you look at 3 and 4, this whole idea is explored even further. They bring a use of color design to really signal the way they present themselves. With 3 in particular, it's flooded with bright reds, liminal architecture, and overall exudes a much more youthful and aggressive aesthetic. The environment really reflects Heather's young age, perverting both the mundanity and the wonder of these familiar locations in a more ominous and dangerous light, playing into the idea of how a teenager's perception of the world begins to shift as they begin to grow into young adulthood. It taps into the stresses that we all face and the frustrations and grief and, terror of shifting from being a teenager to a young adult and our position in the world. It plays into our newfound mortality that at some point we all become aware of as we leave the ignorance and obliviousness that childhood had afforded us. And as for Silent Hill 4, that's a bit harder of a game to really pinpoint due to just how much is really going on with this one. But I think just seeing some of these gameplay clips and the world around you should give an idea of just how different it appears than any other game in the series. Now, I bring all this up because with Silent Hill 2, it does do the same thing, but the big difference here is that it's much more muted and subdued. And that's no accident. If you're at all familiar with the Silent Hill series, then I think it should come as no controversy to say that Silent Hill 2 is the most boring and bland in the series in terms of its visual motifs and overall aesthetic. Okay, before you start reeing at me in the comments, I'm not saying that it's bad. I'm just saying that it's purposely mundane and subdued, and that's actually one of its greatest strengths. I said earlier that this is the most oppressive form that Silent Hill has taken, and the mundanity of the world is a huge part of that. All the environments are cold and hollow, a place where no flowers bloom and hope isn't even a thought in the distance. All around us is gray fog and rundown suburbia, rooms and buildings that look as if the apocalypse hit, and these are just the remains of what's left. Now, to a certain extent, all the games feel this way, but there's just something about 2 where it's much more pronounced. And I think this is emphasized by the fact that the other world isn't really a thing here. James will wander into rusty, more demented forms of the regular world, but outside of a few standout moments, we never see the horrific and warped versions of reality presented in 1, 3, 4, well, even the bad games. It's just much more muted and minimalistic here. And that's because this muted and hollow world is actually reflective of James himself. James isn't really a person by the time that we meet him. He's just a husk at this point. A shell with but the embers of what once was. The grief and denial that led James to Silent Hill in the first place frames its embodiment, hence the contrast we see when peering through Angela's eyes later in the game. Silent Hill 2's world is brutalist in nature. It has a similar atmosphere to those gray, depressing pictures of old Russian towns, full of these identical and brutal commie blocks. Even the inside of the apartments when we get there, while they still look a little bit more Western in nature, they do hold quite a bit of visual and emotional similarities to what could be seen in those Russian blocks as well. Small, claustrophobic, sterile, and once again, oppressive. Now, I joked about the commie blocks, and while they are depressing and liminal in quality, the term brutalist actually refers to the UK's embrace of similar but even more depressing apartment complexes. And well, just about every other kind of building. For those of you who aren't privy to such interesting yet absolutely fucking boring knowledge, like that of architectural effects on psychology, let's try to break this down just a little bit. In dummy terms, just like different colors can evoke different responses in the human brain, like the calming zen of dark blue versus the anxiety and urgency-inducing bright red, things such as shape and form can also heavily affect our mind's perception of the world around us. Now, to put this in less dummy but still simplistic terms, think of how we see Scandinavian cottage villages. These are very brutal places to live, especially in the extremely harsh winters, whether it's Norway or it's Sweden or Finland or any of these other nations in this part of the world. But they don't look cold and oppressive. And that's because when we look at these old cottage houses, their designs are made with these warm and pleasant colors and for lack of a better word, these cute shapes and designs. It really makes them feel like a beacon of safety and coziness. And it contrasts the harsh winters, or even in the summer, they pop over the lush greens of the grass and the trees that they always feel like a safety net. We can see them physically, and it mentally adjusts our way of seeing the environment in general. Now, let's take the same idea and flip it. Think about those aforementioned Soviet apartments. The dark grays and the dull browns covered by a gloomy, often cloudy sky, with their harsh angular and rectangle designs. A building in front of you that doesn't really contrast the harshness of the weather, but rather a building that exudes its own harsh coldness to it. A building that feels oppressive, mechanical, and monolithic. Now, this is a subtle thing that most of us would not consciously think about, but subconsciously, we will feel it. Our emotions and mental state often reflect that of our surroundings. Brutalist architecture is purposely designed to evoke these feelings. The very basis of brutalism is that of utility, practicality and minimalism. The designs are focused around using as little materials as possible while also maximizing usage. And this is why these old UK apartments were often left unpainted and undecorated and left as these cold monochrome monoliths. Brutalism was often used for government buildings, universities, and public housing, meant to reflect a sense of durability and modern efficiency. But the problem in doing that is that it also brought a large element of oppression and powerlessness. The raw concrete and lack of any ornamentation, or rather any human qualities, makes them feel just alienating. There's no effort to make sense of comfort and safety here. Instead, this whole style of architecture embodies a sense of pure domination. And due to its association with bureaucracy and governmental powers, as well as the fact that it just kind of looks like a fucking prison, it became linked with bureaucratic power, surveillance, and control. So these associations that people had with them only further pushed them into carrying that oppressive monolithic feel. The looming presence and unfriendly design elements can make people just feel small, watched, and ultimately powerless, making them feel like they're stuck in a spot in the world. And this association has only been furthered due to the both fictional and historical representations of the very design philosophy. We see it in a lot of dystopian science fiction, like that of 1984, or even similarly in Blade Runner. Although that example has its own little thing going on with the corporate dystopia elements of the neon lighting and advertisements, but that's neither here nor there. It still exudes a certain air of brutalism. But if we go into the real world, we can also see genuine historical examples of how this association came as well. And, well, it's the old Soviet and communist-ruled countries. Both Asia and Eastern Europe were home to this sort of design and these sorts of buildings, and, well, without getting too into the weeds with it, let's just say these aren't places known for their humanitarian or utopian societies or prosperous economic systems, leaving people with full stomachs and happy careers. Where this all really comes to a head is in the overall design of the town and its color scheme. While it isn't as over-the-top brutalistic as the Soviet or British apartment blocks, when we walk through the town, we get a cross between the apocalyptic emptiness of the town's shopping district and the oppressive monoliths that make up its hospital and apartments. They're cold and oppressive, devoid of any color beyond brown and rust, and they carry that same minimalistic nature to them, and even on the inside, as dirty and run down as they can be, they still sit there with a boring, surface-level, sterile shithole design that you would expect from brutalist architecture. And it's this very oppressive nature where the world itself reflects the oppressive nature of James' psyche. James is a husk with no real control. Throughout the game, we see that he's more so just a slave to his instincts and the things that led him to Silent Hill in the first place. He knows he won't find anything here. He understands that what's happening is impossible, and that all around him is impending doom and danger. But the bureaucracy of fate says that he must keep going, and just like that, he gives in, with little regard for his own safety or life. He's just a victim to the world around him. And James' overall denial of his situation and his place is indicative of the road that he's walking. It's almost as if the fog that surrounds him in the town reflects that of the fog that's enveloping his brain and his own understanding. And for the player, everything reinforces this very powerlessness that we feel as we're left in this bleak and colorless world, wandering the corpse of what once was a bustling town where hundreds of people used to live. I say this is a reflection of James because, like previously stated, if we were to look at the other games in the series, Silent Hill always takes a form reflective of the person whose perspective we see it from. Whether it's the ambiguous monsters comment from Vincent that he makes to Heather in 3, or it's the frozen wasteland that Cheryl sees in Shattered Memories, or even the liminal hellscape of 4. The town represents the mind and heart of the protagonist. But on a more real level, this could just be chalked up to a difference in design between games, which might be a fair point if you're a complete cynical bastard, but as I've brought up a few times now, we have the eyes of Angela. Her view of the world really shows just how pertinent this point is, because it's a complete reversal of the way James sees the town. And the reason for that is simple. The demons that James carries are far different from the ghosts that haunt Angela, and even Eddie for that matter. And that's because, as with James, each of the other characters are walking a very similar path, and the roads that they walk embody each of their own turmoil and decisions, a manifestation of the life they've lived and the things that they can't run away from. And coincidentally, the more we dig into how the town is a manifestation of James and the other characters, it means that we have to talk about everyone's favorite dead horse, Liminality. Now, a few years ago, I did a big dive into how Liminality played into the original 4 games. But in order to talk about it, we're going to have to tread some similar ground here, but specifically with 2, and how it uses its concept to not only mess with the player, but also dig into how it comes into play with both the visual storytelling, as well as how it plays into the themes of James's character. Like each game in the series, the entire town feels like one massive liminal space, with all sorts of nostalgic yet decrepit environments, odd repetitions that would drive anyone mad, and a setting that, yes, looks like they would fit into someone's Garry's Mod Backrooms map perfectly. It is there to feed into Silent Hill's signature use of the Uncanny Valley. And while it's far more subdued here compared to the rest of the series, it's still shown off in heavy force. One would only need to visit the prison or hospital, and especially the apartments, to really feel it. And with our given familiarity with many of the town settings, it helps to create an even more ominous, dread-inducing atmosphere when we see them portrayed in such a twisted and dark light. But the star of the show in terms of Silent Hill 2's use of liminality isn't actually the environments. In my opinion, it's portrayed in the characters and roaming monsters. Aside from one very specific creature we encounter in the game, all the enemies that we face are some sort of distorted feminine and blatantly sexual design. And while this is partially due to symbolism, it's also another case of liminality being used here to great effect. Each of them have distinctly sexual features, from their asses to their long feminine legs, big busty tits. You get the idea. All of them are also incomplete, however, and they're missing key human features, which never allows them to fully feel human either. And by doing so, it creates an extremely uncanny and liminal aspect to each one of these monsters. But in order to talk about that, we do need to do some breaking down of just what liminality is, at least in terms of how it's used with these sort of creatures. A common misconception about the idea of liminality is that it's simply the Uncanny Valley, or more specifically, that it's just the Uncanny Valley when applied to rooms, buildings, and other physical spaces. And while that's most of what the popular forms it takes in modern culture is, the concept of the liman goes a lot deeper than that and can apply to just about anything. So why don't we take a look at its definition?
Liminality is a quality of being in between two places or stages, on the verge of transitioning to something new. There's a liminality to the brief moment between being asleep and being fully awake.
In essence, it's a transitional phase, an in-between. Hence why it triggers the uncanny valley. Because when we see a normal room, it's not really liminal, it's just a room. And when we see it as a destroyed or fully decrepit mess, it's just a gross, destroyed mess of a room. Though, when we see it in the halfway point, when we see things falling apart, the clear transition, yet still remaining in its overall familiar visage, that's when we experience the liminal. As we are subconsciously still seeing it for what it once was, but physically, it's not that bad. It's not so far gone that we can just subconsciously process it as a new place. And that's where we find that creepy spot where liminality exists.
Periods of liminality are transitional, sometimes disorienting, and frequently involve waiting for something new to begin. A good example is the summer after high school graduation. Whether you're starting college in the fall or looking for a job, you're on the verge of crossing a threshold into a new stage of your life. Liminality is rooted in this idea of threshold, a kind of doorway between the past and the future.
To cut to brass tacks, it's the transitional phase, and often that uncanny place where things shift between each other. Again, an easy thing to see with physical spaces, but it's also a concept that can be used to play with body horror, something that's up front and center at the heart of Silent Hill 2's enemy design. Take a look at just about any of them. Each are some weird half-in, half-out monster, and because of their very human characteristics, contrasted by the disgusting and consistently obscured nature of their more monstrous bits, the creatures of Silent Hill 2 stick out as being even more frightening than the other games in a lot of ways, because they just feel fucking wrong to look at. Their movements feel painful to watch, and in general, they're just things that shouldn't exist. And not in the way a traditional monster shouldn't exist because it's a monster, but with these things, they just exist as these pure embodiments of pain and suffering. Now, let's compare them to other forms of body horror that we can see in video games, like Dead Space necromorphs, which, yes, they're pretty terrifying, but we just see them as monsters. Aside from a few of the more controversial enemy types, most of the monsters in that series are just that, monstrous creatures. Now, for something a bit closer to Silent Hill, we can take a look at the Fatal Frame series. And sure, some of these ghosts are pretty creepy, and they can be pretty terrifying when you think you're safe somewhere and you hear them in the distance, making the entire game an unsettling and scary experience. But alas, when you just look at them, you see them for what they are, ghosts. Just like how in Dead Space, the necromorphs are just alien creatures. But here in Silent Hill 2, what do you see these things as? They're monsters for sure, but the way they move like crippled people, the way they look partially human, and at that, a lot of times more sexual and erotic. Though, the second you notice their more human and erotic nature, you also notice the grotesque, diseased-looking skins, the odd mounds of flesh in impossible proportions. These monsters use liminality to accentuate their body horror. The first and most obvious is the humanoid monster angle. They look partially human and like vulnerable, sad depictions of that. But the second and more poignant way that they play into liminality is in their aforementioned eroticism. A lot of these enemies carry what can be seen as traditionally erotic elements. It weaponizes something as primal as our fear of the unknown and aversion to disease, by also playing into our typical erotic attractions, and in turn, this creates this uncanny and horrific visage that we're forced to deal with for the entirety of the game. And once again, this all comes back to reflect that of our protagonist, James Sunderland. But in order to continue, I think it's time we need to get a deeper understanding of James, but more importantly, we need to shed some light on his shadow. Ah yes, Pyramid Head. Silent Hill's nemesis. It's Mr. X. Silent Hill's haunting specter who finds you when you don't want him to, and pursues you throughout the game, and coincidentally, the only masculine creature that we come face to face with. Unlike any of the other monsters, Pyramid Head is not only the only masculine creature, but the only one that feels like it's directly meant to be a monster, rather than some painful body horror abomination. He's a hulking man with a metal pyramid mask, who slowly wanders around with a massive sword. He's the embodiment of a punisher, or more aptly, the embodiment of an executioner, which is why his garb and his mask are reminiscent of that. And given his aims to kill James when he comes across him, it's clear what his ultimate purpose is. And even then, his actions with the other monsters really paint him for what he is. In one of our first interactions with James, he walks in on Pyramid Head as he is very obviously sexually assaulting a mannequin. His posturing over them is similar to his posturing over everyone he comes across, dominating and violent, forceful and demanding. But the one place where Pyramid Head's behavior becomes more complex is when he isn't acting as a giant force of death and destruction. We have multiple encounters with him that end with Pyramid Head not killing James, and instead indirectly guiding him to the next area of the town, as if he's either playing with us as James is his food or something, or rather he's attempting to push James to a bigger and more important goal. But regardless, with this kind of behavior and portrayal, it really begs the question, just what would Pyramid Head be guiding James through?
You! It was you, wasn't it? You're the one who stepped on my hand.
I don't know. Maybe I did.
What's a little girl like you doing here anyway?
Huh? Are you blind or something?
What's that letter?
None of your business. You didn't love Mary anyway.
Wait! How do you know Mary's name?
For the lion's share of the game, it just sees James embark on a bit of a wild goose chase, or rather, a demented game of treasure hunt where the treasure is his dead wife. From our first steps out of the restroom, to finding the key on a corpse, to our encounter with Pyramid Head at the end of the apartment complex, and every place Maria drags us to search for clues, a lot of James' journey is more or less aimless as he searches for Mary. And the further that he gets into the town, the more of its inhabitants he meets, and things only continue to make less and less sense. Crossing paths with an aloof and strange man named Eddie who swears he didn't kill anyone. A mean-spirited little girl who doesn't seem to be experiencing any of the horrors the town has to offer named Laura, or a troubled and stunted friend, Angela, the woman we came across in the graveyard. And lastly, we have the strange woman we meet named Maria. who looks eerily similar to James's wife, yet acts as the opposite of her personality, and seems to know a lot more than she lets on. But the interesting thing here is that with each of these various characters that we meet, they're just the same as James in a lot of ways. Aimless and lost souls who felt called to Silent Hill and can't really tell anyone why they're there. The story of the game unfolds less like a man on a quest and more so like a rat being guided through an eerie and horrific maze, with various entities guiding him forward, areas revealing themselves to him as they see fit, and most prominently, as if the hands of fate are pulling at the strings of a marionette. And the more this all plays out, the more we see the other side to our protagonist. The more information he gets, the more his mask will slip, and we see a much angrier and much more aggressive personality begin to show itself.
Hey, let's go after her.
Huh? Laura? But why?
Laura. Is that her name?
That's what she said.
This town is full of monsters. How can you sit there and eat pizza?
She said she was fine by herself. She said a fatso like me would just slow her down.
Forget you.
As mentioned before, as the game goes on, James's facade will continue to crack, and we'll see more holes in the oblivious and timid shell that he hides in. It's why Angela reacts so defensive and negatively at him at times, and why Maria will constantly taunt him with knowledge she knows only he would have. And Laura, the most innocent character here, always seems to look at James with a bit of hatred and anger. The truth about James is that he is a monster. The surface level evil is the big one, and that's that James is a murderer. He killed his wife for his own selfish desires, and attempted to justify it to himself before eventually resolving to just bury his guilt in denial. But that's just the surface level of what makes him a monster. No, James is not a monster just because he's a killer. He's a monster because he's been engulfed by his shadow. Now, to break that apart a bit, Carl Jung's concept of the shadow is a commonly used trope in psychological stories, and that's simply because the shadow in itself is such an intricate and personal concept that depending on the character, it can drastically change how it manifests. When I introduced James, I made reference to one of the most famous examples of the shadow, that being Patrick Bateman. And while these two characters on the surface seem like polar opposites, the reality is that they actually have quite a bit in common. And that's all due to their acts of repression and the manifestations of their shadow. Like James, Patrick was once a relatively normal person, but due to bitter dissatisfaction with his life, the inability to cope through materialism and wealth, and a growing sense of neuroticism from being stuck in the privileged yet caged position he has in life, he repressed his shadow so much that it began to materialize more and more through his typical lifestyle, making him grow colder and more psychotic, becoming much more of a misanthrope, until he eventually began to feed into that darkness and allow his shadow to take him, turning Patrick into the horrific monster that we all know and love. James here is no different. Sure, he's far less viscerally broken and repugnant compared to a character as foul as Bateman, but the core of the matter is that of the shadow. James's shadow presents through his behavior, but even then, he is someone far more repressed than your typical shadow-tinged characters like Bateman, Tyler Durden, or even Mr. Hyde. Rather, the real James is shown by Silent Hill itself, manifesting as the inner demons that he can't contain anymore, and becoming a complete embodiment of his repression. Silent Hill 2 is not about a haunted town. It's not about the monsters that go bump in the night. It's not even about a man who simply killed his wife and is now facing the music. Silent Hill 2 is a game about a man consumed by his shadow, embarking on a journey of acceptance and punishment. Now, the Jungian shadow is a pretty easy concept to understand. But if you want to get in depth, it becomes much larger and heavier of a topic to delve into. But for our purposes here today, we just need to know what it is and how it functions. The shadow, to put it simply, is our traits, thoughts, desires, and even at times actions that we wish to deny and repress. A common theme of this very video is the idea of repression, and that's because even outside of James, each character, aside from one, is facing a similar issue, and that's their desire to repress, deny, and flee the sins or the tragedies of their past. The shadow self is the part of us that is made up of the things that we wish to deny, whether it be our lust, our greed, taboo thoughts, or jealousy, you name it. And it doesn't always have to be the negatives of ourselves either. It can be innocuous things that we might not like to show out of embarrassment. But regardless, it's the things that we try to ignore or push down and repress. And if we never choose to embrace them healthily or quash them in any meaningful way, they will over time begin to manifest in other ways, or in the worst scenarios, become what encompasses us over time.
The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, for no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. To become conscious of it involves recognizing the dark aspects of the personality as present and real. The act is the essential condition of any kind of self-knowledge.
The shadow can manifest in many different ways, but in the case of James, his denial and repression led him to rot. Watching his wife suffer, letting himself suffer as his needs were being denied, and due to his own selfishness and denial of what he was dealing with, the guilt he felt for the building resentment towards his once beloved wife and the turmoil it caused him would be his undoing. It would act as a ticking time bomb before all that repressed negativity, hatred, and guilt would bubble up to the surface and eat him alive. But the funny thing is, James wasn't always like this. And before the events of Silent Hill 2, he and Mary's lives were much different. But James wasn't always like this. In the beginning, James and Mary were a passionate and happy couple. But not long into their marriage, it all began to fall apart when Mary came down with an illness that she couldn't beat. Given a short window of life left to live, the disease would quickly begin to eat away at her, and the trauma of watching this would quickly start to eat James as well. What compounded from this was an illness that led more and more to emotional and mental volatility in Mary, who had begun to lash out at James, causing him to sink further into his own mind and plant the seeds of his resentment. The realization that Mary's impending mortality and illness was going to not only leave James a widow, but also would be the end of his dream of ever having children, not to mention that it also must have made it feel like all that time he had spent was in vain. The rock of his life was going to crumble. The once passionate lover that he wanted to spend the rest of his days with is now being cut short as she devolves further into a volatile husk of herself. The weight of all this caused James to begin to drink, and he would turn to alcohol to deal with his internal feelings. And as you could probably guess, this would only make things get worse and feed into the very darkness and hatred that was already starting to grow inside of him. He began to visit Mary less and less. and the distance would only make that wedge grow more. Add on to this James's growing sexual frustration, and it was like gasoline on a campfire, especially when he was constantly surrounded by younger, healthier, and hotter nurses. And like any toxic seeds, the constant rain of tension and negativity gave it life, as the ivy of that hatred and resentment continued to grow, until it finally led to a breaking point. The split of hatred and resentment, with the love and turmoil all caused by Mary's illness, would leave James' mind broken. And at that point, he would finally make a decision, giving her one last kiss, before he picked up a pillow and suffocated her to death. James is a murderer. And the revelation of this recontextualizes and decodes everything. Oftentimes, when people talk about Silent Hill 2, they tend to go on about the shadow, just like I have. But most of the time, they really only do it in regards to a character, and maybe a couple monsters. And you might think, how could there be so many different interpretations? But that's where the strength of Silent Hill 2 lies. Because while we can hyper-focus on one or two things, in all reality, the entire town and everything inside of it is James' shadow. The rabbit hole of this is why there's so many fucking videos, essays, blog posts, and forum posts going on and on about this game. It's why after 20 plus years, it's still legendary. Because depending on how deep you want to go, depends on how much you'll find. This is why I brought up brutalism and brutalist architecture before. The town is manifesting in such a way because it embodies the mind and mentality of James himself. He's stuck in this gray, colorless world and trapped in a constant state of insignificance because he himself, through the trauma of Mary's illness, became insignificant. And rather than power through it, he gave in, and he became a neglectful partner, leaving his wife to rot and die alone. And just how that guilt, turmoil, and resentment made him feel, the town now takes on that very form, even its other world. With every other protagonist, the worlds are vibrant, full of horrors and insanity, demonic entities and bizarre creatures. Where here, James is just more or less alone, with monsters walking around that are more esoteric, and a world that's just slightly rustier than what can be seen in the real world. But it presents itself this way because it's presenting itself as oppressive, demoralizing, and as that crushing weight felt from the brutalism of the town, manifesting the same way James' psyche is in its current state. Oppressive and demented. And that's just the top layer. Because from the creatures, our very own boogeyman, to the other people in the town, each takes on a different form of James' shadow and a manifestation of a part of himself. The monsters here are a core part of the visual storytelling and exploration, as each manifests similar but different aspects of James's mind and shadow. Some are very upfront and obvious, while others are a bit more abstract. Now, to give an example of this, we only need to look as far as the iconic Bubble Nurse. It's more than apparent what she symbolizes. The nurse on the surface takes the form of James' lust for the very nurses he saw during his time at the hospital, seeing younger, more attractive women who contrasted with the scared and sick woman that James was supposed to be there to see. But their symbolism is more than just lust. It actually goes deeper, as if we take a look at the bandages that veil their heads, both take the form as a sign of sickness as well as suffocation. It's why there's blood on their uniforms and faces, and it's also why they're constantly twitching and moving, like they're struggling to gasp for air. It's this sort of visual storytelling that makes Silent Hill 2 such a powerful experience, because almost everything is deeper than just what's on the surface. Again, another enemy type that's like this would be the mannequin, which, yeah, James likes legs, he's a horny bastard, but it's another manifestation of lust that goes more than just James is horny. Because if we take a closer look, there are braces on these mannequins, and they are there to represent the same ones that Mary needed in order to walk towards the end of her life. And the lack of a head or any real upper torso also shows that this is a manifestation of denial. James is not allowing himself to see the full figure of his wife, as he represses his memory due to his guilt. And that's because, contrary to popular belief, James isn't just some horny guy that couldn't handle not getting some fucking pussy from his wife. He's a lot more complex than that. He is partly that. He is partly a man deprived of sex, giving into his libido and his lust, but he's also a man that has been emotionally starved, lacking the affection and support that he desired from Mary as she continued to morph into a husk of herself. And that's not to blame Mary for becoming that way, because she's diseased and dying. Of course that's what's going to happen. But you have to put yourself into the mind of somebody like James. While we can rationalize the way that Mary treated him, and we can understand how that happens, when we put ourselves in James's shoes, it's a little easier to understand why we might repress, why we might decide not to visit, and why we might decide to turn to alcohol to bury our feelings even more. Because if you just take a little bit further to think about Jane's perspective, how do you not instantly feel guilty and disgusted with yourself for hating your wife simply for being ill? And once again, this is where the game comes to play upon James's shadow with the monsters who aren't sexual in nature. One of the most haunting creatures that we come across in Silent Hill 2 is the Mandarin, a feminine creature that hangs from grates and whose arms contain human mouths, which are used to attack James. And these monsters are different because not only do they actually have mouths, but their symbolism is that of Mary. Mary's anger and the verbal abuse and frustration that she took out on James. It's a manifestation of his own fear and resentment to her words. And just to give one last example, we have the flesh lip, which is pretty self-explanatory. It's an even more contorted version of Mary in her sickbed, with a mouth on its abdomen, a brutal and sad visage of how James perceived his wife by the end. And like the town's brutal and oppressive manifestation, all of these creatures also embody aspects of James' shadow, whether it's pieces of his lust, pieces of his guilt, or an embodiment of resentment. And with some of them, it's all of them put together. But if that's the case with the regular enemies, then what does that leave Pyramid Head?
Stop! Leave her alone! Leave us both the hell alone! Ah!
Pyramid Head might be seen as the manifestation of James's shadow or even his boogeyman, but in reality he's a little more complex than that. And he's also a little less important than people think. Like all the other monsters, he is a manifestation of something specific. And in this case, he's the pure embodiment of James's guilt and his desire for punishment, as well as a visage of the brutality that James had given into. This is why we see him assaulting and harming the other monsters. And it's also why he has an executioner-like design. So I guess in a way he could be considered James's shadow, but he's more so a manifestation of all of James's negative elements as its own creature. But it's this aspect of Pyramid Head which also causes him to indirectly act as a guide for James. Because Pyramid Head isn't really here to kill James, at least not exactly. He's more so here to teach James a lesson. And that's why once James comes to confess, and he finally accepts the sins that he spent the entirety of the game running away from, is when the Pyramid Heads disappear, and they decide to end their own life. Because Pyramid Head is no longer needed. What really separates Pyramid Head apart from all the other manifestations of James' shadow is that, like I said before, he's more of a pure embodiment of James's shadow self. The monstrous womanizer who harms those who get in his way, and carries all of that repressed lust, anger, and resentment that James refused to acknowledge, and indirectly carried with him. And that's also why he's James's guide through the town, because he's forcing James to see the truth that he hides from himself. And when he's no longer needed, he disappears. But once again, we're back to begging the question. If Pyramid Head is the manifestation of James's shadow self, then what of the game's other most iconic creature? Maria.
James, honey, did something happen to you? After we got separated in that long hallway? Are you confusing me with someone else? You were always so forgetful. Remember that time in the hotel?
Maria?
You said you took everything, but you forgot that videotape we made. I wonder if it's still there.
How do you know about that? Aren't you Maria?
I'm not your Mary.
So, you're Maria?
I am. If you want me to be.
Maria is the second most prominent character in the game, and for a large chunk of it, is James's companion through the town. Though she doesn't just follow him around like a normal person would. Rather, Maria is constantly taunting James and playing with him in ominous ways, never fully showing her deck of cards, and always playing into being helpful just enough to keep the facade up. She knows far more than she lets on and plays into James's lust and seems to take a twisted pleasure in doing so. In a lot of ways, Maria can actually be seen as the game's true antagonist. And she always feels that way when she speaks with us. There's always just something wrong about her. And that's the thing. Maria is because she isn't real. She's not a person. She's merely a manifestation. It's why in a town full of odd and strange people, she somehow is the most social, yet the most bizarre and off-putting. And where she fits into James's journey through his shadow is that Maria is the Animus, or to better understand what that means, she is the ideal self, and in this case, the ideal self of Mary. Maria is James's wish fulfillment. It's why they look identical to Maria, yet carry a much more sexual and erotic nature. It's why she's everything James wants, and he constantly gets confused of her being his wife. She's a manifestation of his repressed issues, his repressed desires, and his, well, perfect Maria. That's also why Pyramid Head is consistently trying to kill Maria, and does so at multiple points in the game. Though, despite her dying and us watching her die, she somehow always seems to appear again, and then will gaslight James regarding her fate. Maria is the spider luring him into a web of deception, keeping James in the darkness of his repression. And where this all really comes full circle is with the game's multiple endings. Silent Hill 2 has quite a few different endings, but in reality there's only 4. Because the other 2 of 6 are just jokes, and that's the ridiculous UFO ending, as well as the dog ending. But when it comes to the actual 4, I guess canonical if you want to call them that, endings, they do play directly into the themes of the Shadow, and James's ultimate fate is represented by how he interfaces with it. Now, the first and most generic one is the leave ending. And I won't waste too much time talking about this because this is kind of the wish fulfillment good ending that every game kind of has connected with it, because not everyone wants a bad ending. Here, James finds yet another woman who looks like Mary but isn't, and after fighting her, we will see him admit his resentment towards Mary and come clean about his issues. And in the end, he leaves the town with Laura, ready to continue on with his life. This is, like I said, essentially the good ending, but it doesn't really explore the Shadow much. It kind of just ends the journey and allows for a nice storybook ending to appear. Where things really get interesting, however, is with the other 3 endings. One of the most important ones in understanding the story is the Maria ending. In here, we will see James meet a woman again, and this time she will identify as Mary herself. A final battle ensues, and when it ends, James meets back up with Maria, convinced that he just fought another manifestation. And after this, he opts to leave the town with Maria, finally choosing her as his future and embracing the delusions of his Animus. But as they leave, Maria begins to cough, hinting that she also has the same disease as Mary. What makes this so poignant is that in this ending, there's a complete lack of acceptance from James. He won't really accept his sin and his issues, and due to this, he is now leaving the town with a manifestation that is a complete wish fulfillment, but one that's a bit of a monkey's paw. And he'll be doomed to repeat the same cycle he went through with Mary with Maria, trapped in a purgatory of his own shadow until he ultimately comes to terms with the truth of his actions. And what plays to this even more is yet another ending, this one known as Rebirth, where essentially the same sort of thing plays out, though this time instead of fighting Mary, the woman identifies as Maria and James defeats her. But here, the difference is, instead of leaving the town with Maria like before or with Laura, James stays. And he goes deeper into the town, taking Mary's body to the church in order to attempt to resurrect her. A path that we know will lead to nothing good, and more than likely will end in even more misery and punishment. It's once again James denying at the last minute the reality of his situation and the sins of his past. And because of that, falling deeper into a pit of delusion and deeper into a pit of punishment. But where this all comes full circle is with my favorite ending, and the one that I think is the most conclusive to the story here, and that would be the in-water ending. The in-water ending is both the most tragic and the most logical conclusion to Silent Hill 2's story. As before, the same situation ensues where we end up fighting Maria once James refuses to accept her. But this time when he defeats her, he finally does get to see Mary one last time. And here, they both tell the truth. Mary accepts what she's become, but more importantly, James finally confesses. He admits why he did what he did. He admits his selfishness, his anger and his resent, the things that led him to doing what he did. And in doing so, the truth sets him free. He admits he didn't kill Mary because he wanted to end her suffering, but rather he killed her to end his own, and for his own selfish reasons. And in doing so, Mary finally gives him the gift that he's been looking for this entire game. And that's forgiveness. And with that, James finally is complete. He finally realizes the ire of his ways and accepts the wrong that he did and the monster that he's become. And in doing so, he realizes that he can't go on anymore. Not without Mary, and not with the deeds that he's done. So James takes her body and puts it in the passenger seat of his car, before finally letting it all go and accepting his death, driving both him and Mary into the lake so they can rest forever in their special place. It's a dark and bleak way to end the story, but in many ways, it's the only real way that it could have ended. All the other fates leave James stuck in his repressed state, trapped in an escapist position where he's doomed to face his shadow again and again, and repeat the same painful cycle until he eventually comes to this point. But here in the in-water ending, he finally finds acceptance. He stops running and gives in to the punishment that he knows he needs. And in a twisted way, he ends his journey by finally becoming complete with his shadow. The horrific journey of James Sunderland is a powerful experience. Not because of its monsters or its town or because it's a sequel to one of the greatest horror games ever made, but because it's an experience that doesn't tell us everything, and rather it shows us much more than it ever explains, and uses that strength to convey so much that we'll never notice on the surface level, but we'll feel on a very deep subtextual one. Silent Hill 2 takes the concept of Carl Jung's shadow and contorts it into this oppressive, heart-pulling experience. And it does so because it tells us a story that we don't just get to watch unfold on a screen, but we get to directly interact with, making it all feel much more poignant and powerful than it could have if it was simply a novel or a film. And that's because at the end of the day, Silent Hill 2 is a game that's not just about coming to terms with the truth, not just about monsters, but it's a game about the age-old lesson that no matter how fast or how far you run, you can't escape the sins of your past. Now, before we go, there is just one last thing that I'd like to show you. This is my wall of shame. The list of names of people who keep the lights on and keep me chained to the computer making videos like nothing else matters. I couldn't thank them enough for all the support they give, and all jokes aside, they're a big reason why I continue to do what I do. So, if you enjoy the content as well and want to see it continue to flow out like water, then links for my Patreon are down below. Now, I apologize for the long wait between this video and the last one. I'll try not to have as big of a gap again. As I've said in my community post, it's just been pretty crazy with everything going on in life right now, and without getting too deep into that, things will continue to go as normal, but you know, if you see me go dark for a bit, I'm not dead, I'm not gone, I'm just busy and handling some stuff. So I hope you enjoyed the video. This was a big project for me because Silent Hill is my favorite video game series of all time. And Silent Hill 2, while it's not my favorite of all of them, that's 3, it's still a game that means quite a bit to me. And I do plan on making more videos going in on some of the other characters that I didn't really talk about here, since I wanted to focus a lot more on James and the shadow element of the whole story. But you can expect me talking about people like Angela and Maria in the future, because, you know, I didn't talk about Born from a Wish. I didn't really go into the other characters too much. So that will come in the future, and I hope you all look forward to it. And for everyone who wants to call me a moron or an idiot for my take on the series, well, hey man, it's my interpretation. You can kiss my ass if you don't like it. But with that being said, I hope you all enjoyed the video. I hope to see you in the future, and I've got a lot more content coming your way. So subscribe, follow me on Twitter, and I'll see you in the next video.
Your little pussy belongs to me.